Okay, we're now live. Fantastic. So, hello again, Teodora. Thanks for joining the Skype call. I'm sorry for the constant rescheduling as well. It's been a very busy couple of weeks.
It has, yeah. It's that time of the year, I think.
Yeah, definitely. But I'm glad we managed to make it in the end.
Yes,
And of course, as you know, I've got a few questions I've got planned for today.
sure,
But before we get into that, I just want to address the audience and
sure.
just, for those who are watching and listening, this talk will be about how technology affects child development. So looking at all
Sure.
facets of child development from intellectual development to emotional intelligence development and social intelligence development. So all facets of child development.
Yep.
And for those of you who don't know, this is Teodora Pavkovic,
Hmm.
and she is a therapist, psychologist, and parenting coach with a focus on digital wellness. She's an inspiring figure for psychologists, and me personally, I've looked into a lot of what she does, and I'm already a big fan. And
Hmm.
yeah, in fact, it's inspiring for just to see the journey you've taken and
Mm.
to where you are now, and the fact that you're continuing to be an activist to preserve humanity in the face of technology. So, really
Hmm.
looking forward to hearing your knowledge and expertise on this subject. And
Thank you.
a good place to start would be, I want to hear from you is what your motivation was to explore the ways in which technology affects children.
Sure, sure. Well, thank you first of all, Azim, for inviting me, and I really
Yeah.
admire the work that you're trying to do as well, and a lot of the awareness that you're trying to bring around a lot of these topics. I think we need to have as many people as we possibly can kind of gathered around this topic. I think some portions of the kind of global population are taking this seriously and are spending
Mm.
a lot of time and effort and money in some cases looking into it. But I don't think there's still quite enough people doing it yet. So I always appreciate meeting anybody who's trying to raise a little bit more awareness about some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. And like you said, we're mostly going to be kind of focusing on that aspect of children and how technology impacts them, what technology use can potentially do to child development. But as we all know, there's so many facets of technology and the impact that it has on human beings, on humanity, everything from the ethics of it to the way data or devices rather are designed, data privacy. There's so many different things. But for me, but kind of personally and professionally, I've just always been interested in children in general. And so I've been working with kids for a very, very long time in all sorts of different kind of capacities. I've worked with kids as an educator. I've worked with kids as a babysitter. I've worked with kids as a therapist and then as a parenting coach with their parents. So I'm always really interested in everything and anything that impacts kids. I kind of I don't discriminate when it comes to that. So the time at around which I kind of got interested in technology, I think it was around kind of 2015 maybe or 2014 even. I was living in Singapore at the time, and of course, many of us know kind of what technology use looks like in certain parts of far East Asia and Southeast Asia countries like Singapore, like South Korea, like Hong Kong. Technology is really, really highly valued, and it takes up a very kind of significant role in those societies. Of course, South Korea is well known for having the fastest internet in the world. So there's a lot of pride in technology and in technology use, and for parents in particular, there's a really huge emphasis placed on children really knowing how to use technology and learning how to use it from very, very early on. So kind of somewhere there between 2014 to 2016, I was starting to notice that I was seeing a lot of children with devices in their hands, whether those kids were poorly behaved or they were well behaved, whether they looked like they were bored or whether they looked like they were occupied. It didn't really look like there was necessarily a rule. It was just kind of across the board, and very, very young kids as well. So starting from about the age of 2 or 3, I would see little kids being kind of outside in nature on a really nice and sunny day with an iPad or a tablet of some kind or a smartphone of some kind in their hands, and that started to kind of to concern me, first of all, because it looked very, I think now it's a bit more commonplace, although it still really is jarring to me when I see that scene. But it was
Mm.
particularly jarring then because it was still quite new, and it seemed very kind of strange and awkward to me to see kids, again, a lot of the times very well behaved children, just kind of, staring out at the world, probably wondering what in the world is going on this planet, trying to kind of make sense of things, and with that, smartphone or tablet placed in front of their faces. So at the time, I was doing some work as a vision therapist. I was working a lot with kids who had issues with their functional vision, various kinds of deficiencies, and so that was kind of my first, I guess, kind of an entryway into that question of what does screen time or screen use do to kids developmentally when it comes to more kind of those physiological aspects. So things like vision. What will excessive screen use do for vision? And we've known for a very long time, when I was a little kid, the grown-ups would always tell you, don't sit so close to the TV or don't stand so close to it. You have to kind of
Yeah,
move
of
further
course.
back. It's not good for you. So we've always had that in the backs of our minds. Of course, the way in which kids started using technology from about whatever the year it may have been, 2013 or 14, was kind of unprecedented. So we were seeing, those of us who were working in that field, and there weren't that many of us when it comes to vision therapy, we're noticing that screen use and the time spent on screens was really impacting the way kids were able to focus, to visualize. It was affecting all these different facets of their vision and their behavior. And so then for me, with my kind of psychological background, I was then starting to ask some of these more, maybe kind of more deep, more complex questions in terms of what does this do to a child as they begin to develop, as they kind of start trying to understand what the world is like. How does it
Mm.
impact their behavior? How does it impact the parent-child connection, which is really probably the most central thing for me, the most important question for me,
Definitely.
because we know that a child, a human being that comes into this world can't develop properly unless it's attached to at least one other human being. Of course, in an ideal world, you'd want it to be two, to have two parents. Although we always say it takes a village, so the more the better. But you definitely need at least one grown up who's going to be attentive, who's going to be available, who's going to be caring, who's going to be responsive, who's really going to make you feel that you're seen and that you're heard and that you matter, that you're loved and that you're important. Somebody who's going to be very responsive to you, so that when you cry or when you bite or you spit or throw a hissy fit, all the other things we do when we're little, so that there is somebody there who is going to respond to whatever your needs are at that point. We always say that kids' needs kind of come out the most when they're behaved the worst. That is
Mm.
when they really need us the absolute most. So the questions for me in terms of how technology affects children really revolved around that. What does it mean if either if the child is on their device, and so in that case, are they focused, are they distracted, are they aware of, for example, if they're hungry or not? Oftentimes we see parents trying to use technology to make it easier for children to eat or make them eat more or whatever it is. And in certain cases, for example, with kids who are maybe very sensitive when it comes to their senses, in terms of the texture of the food and things like that. Sometimes we see that with autistic kids, for example. Sometimes it really does seem like there's no other way to help these kids eat. So I think absolutely in certain cases, if technology can be used to help that, that's a wonderful thing. But the question really was, if you're looking at just kind of a child who maybe doesn't have those issues related to things like autism, attention deficit disorder, and things like that, what we call, I don't like to use the word normal at all, but let's say a
Mm.
normally, developmentally normal child, although I really don't like that term. But if you insert a device between them and whoever the responsive adult there is, whether it's the child using the device or the adult or both, what does that do for all those needs that a child has when they're very young? Unfortunately, we don't have any definitive answers to that question yet. Unfortunately, this is all a little bit like a kind of a huge global social and psychological and behavioral experiment that we haven't really set the rules for yet. There are certain ways for anybody else in our audience who has studied any kind of science or psychology, that when you want to carry out an experiment, there are a certain number of things that you have to do first. You have to consult the ethics committee, you have to set up your design, you have to say why it is that you want to try and implement the things that you want to implement, you have to say what you assume the outcome is going to be, you have to say why you think this is beneficial, what are the reasons why you should receive funding to carry out this study. So I am oversimplifying it, but only because I want to kind of help people understand that we are really in the midst of an experiment. We're all subjects in this experiment. The other thing that you typically have to do when you conduct an experiment is you have to ask people for consent. And we haven't really been asked for our consent in this global experiment. And so it's still way too early to tell what the outcome is, not just when it comes to kids, but when it comes to us as grown-ups. But for me, I'm not crazy about the idea of kind of sitting around and waiting for studies to come out and for results to come out. The much more important thing for me is to observe the kids who I see through my work, through my personal life, just everyday life as well, and to really listen to what the parents are saying. And a lot of the times they're saying positive things in terms of how technology has helped them and how it's contributed to their life in a positive way. But of course, a lot of the times, the kind of the outcomes or the impact that they're seeing on their kids is really not very positive at all. And so for me, that's the really most important thing to do. That's something that I encourage parents and non-parents alike to do, to really observe the kids in their environment, and to kind of use that in order to figure out how much technology is good technology and in what form should it be, and how much should we expose our kids to tech.
Sure, recently what you said relates a lot to what Mary Eichen said regarding the internet being a social experiment, which we
Sure.
don't know the outcome.
Absolutely.
And, a lot of
Yes.
researchers are saying, oh, well, wait, and then we'll see, but I don't want to wait till the damage is done like you.
Sure.
I think that's
Yeah.
very irresponsible.
Absolutely. And I think, sorry to interrupt you, but I think all the
Yeah,
more
sure.
reason why it's irresponsible, and I talk about this quite often. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind is that you do have this motto of move fast and break things, that was, of course, first made very famous by Mark Zuckerberg, and so it kind of came out of that Facebook environment. But I think in general there has been that approach. And I don't think Mark Zuckerberg is the one who really started it. I think if we look at technological development, especially kind of in the Western Hemisphere, there always has been that kind of we're hurling towards progress, and we don't stop to think about it. And we don't necessarily, again, we don't treat it as you would a scientific experiment. It's just put it together, throw it out there, and then see what's going to happen. And I think in certain cases, that's an absolutely incredible thing to do. We probably wouldn't have landed on the moon if we had been, supremely careful and if we kind of held back in terms of technological development. For me, the concern is when we're talking about our children and when we're talking about the impact that anything, whatever it is, whether it's technology or an item of food or a piece of clothing, whatever it is, experimenting with our children's mental, physical, behavioral, psychological health. I'm pretty sure, guaranteed that nobody wants to do that. Certainly, no parent kind of wants to toy with their kids in that sense. And so I think that's another reason why I feel very strongly about this whole idea of trying to slow down and not break quite as many things, especially not break our children.
Sure. I mean, we had objections to the Zimbardo's experiment back in
Of course.
prisons, and this is kind of an
Sure.
elongated version of that in essence, but
Yeah.
it's not physical damage, it's mental and
Sure.
emotional.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree 100%. There's a lot to unpack from what you've said. I mean, going back
Right.
10 minutes ago to what you
Sure.
said regarding screen time and
Sure.
how the effects of that. I was talking to a psychology lecturer
Right.
about a month ago, and I was talking on this topic, and she said it's difficult to put a limit on, when we should be prescribing children to be allowed to use screen time, because the American
Sure.
Psychological Association said, okay, between 0 to 2 years old,
Yeah.
don't allow it. But then
Yeah.
others have argued, no, expand that even further. But
Sure.
what do you think is
Yeah.
why are they so resistant to give a
Yeah.
definitive recommendation?
Sure. Yeah.
I think
I
that
think
is.
part of the reason, and that was the just a small correction, the American Pediatric Association, not the
Oh,
psychological one.
okay. Right,
Yes,
sure.
yes.
I was getting
They
confused.
do. That's all right. Yeah, that's all right. They're all APAs, including the psychological and psychiatric and pediatric ones. So it gets very confusing. But I think one of the reasons, and I love the people who I love the people who the researchers who work at the American Pediatric Association. I follow all of their work, and I think I feel that they're the kinds of people who we really need to be paying attention to because they're kind of right there in the trenches. They're working with kids day in, day out, and they're observing kind of in real time almost what is happening. And so Dr. Podesky is one of the wonderful researchers who works there, and I follow all of her work. I think one of the reasons why it's very difficult in general to talk about this is because you need to figure out kind of what your anchors are. What are you basing this on? The 0 to 2. What is that based on? So for example, one of the ways that you could look at it is in terms of visual development. And so while I was working as a vision therapist, one of the things that we would talk to parents about is how the visual system develops for children. How do their eyeballs develop, and then the use
Mm,
of screen time, as opposed to kind of looking at the 3D world around them, how that can impact their visual development. And so our rule for no screens before 2 was based on that. So it was a kind of a more physiological reason. If you look at more, physiology is oftentimes a lot easier to define, right? Because it exists
mm,
in the physical world. When you're talking about the psychological development of children, when you're talking about their emotional development, those are all a lot more relative. We can make very kind of global scale generalized terms for how children develop, but not all kids develop in the same way. And any parent knows that. If you're a parent of 2 or 3 kids, you'll find that they develop in completely different ways. And so, you can't be scared about, say, your 2-year-old not having said a word yet, because maybe they're not going to start talking until they're about 3, or maybe until they're about 3.5, and then once they do, they'll be perfectly fine. They'll catch up. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to place that limit, is because not all kids are quite the same.
mm.
But based on many decades of research, we do have a general sense of when kids develop, those milestones, at which point they start developing their abstract thinking, at which point they start developing things like empathy, at which point they're able to share, at which point they're able to understand that mom is not the same as me. I and mom are 2 different human beings. We're not exactly the same thing. It takes kids a little while to actually understand that.
Yeah.
So for a long time, they go on believing, if I'm sad, mom surely has to be sad as well. How come mom isn't sad when I'm sad? So there's that separation. There's that
Mm,
attachment that's hugely important, and then there's that separation that children gradually go through. And in some ways, you could argue we spend our whole lives trying to then unattach from our parents. So the American Pediatric Association uses that wealth of research and kind of looks at some of those milestones to say, okay, before that age of 2, we really don't want there to be that disturbance. We really don't want there to be that interference. And I do believe that they look at the child as a whole. So they will look at physiological things, they will look at
yeah.
psychological, emotional ones, and so on. One of the things that I always like to say is that before the age of, I would say, even about 3 or 4, maybe even as old as 5, the only kind of device that a child needs is the parent. There is nothing else. And kind of to follow through that tech related kind of imagery, or that metaphor, you as a parent, sure, you can learn some tips and tricks, and you can learn little techniques and things that you can use with your child. You need to learn things about nutrition and hydration and things like that to make sure that
Sure.
you keep your baby alive and healthy. But you as a parent already come with all the apps built in. You don't need to download any new ones. And so I always like to tell parents, if you come across any kind of platform or an app or any kind of form of technology that claims that it will teach you how to be the perfect parent, or it will complete you as a parent, it's just an outright lie. It's absolute nonsense. And I say that as a parenting coach, right? So I
Yeah.
go in to help parents, but I never ever want them to feel that they're dependent on me in that sense. I can't possibly know how to parent their child in the way in which they do. It's a very, very special chemical, biological, psychological, emotional bond that's very, very unique. And so that's why my kind of approach to any kinds of, rules or restrictions or recommendations is really always to talk to that family and to talk to those parents, because they know their child better than I will ever get to know their child. I will never end up spending as much time with them as they do. And to say, these are the general guidelines that we have. There are reasons because of which we have them. Are
Mm.
they hard for you to follow? Do you find that they're challenging for you to follow? Do you find it very difficult to not expose your child to some screen-based device before the age of 2? Okay, why is that? What are the moments in which it's very difficult for you not to? What are the reasons because of which you expose your child to technology before that age, or even once they're 5, 6, 7, 8? If you find that your child is spending 10 hours a day on tech. Why are they spending 10 hours? What are they doing during those 10 hours? Where are you while they're doing that? It's very easy for us to give, and I sometimes kind of fall into that trap too, to give very kind of general guidelines in terms of what the ideal, mental and physical and emotional health is of any one individual. But you really
Yeah.
have to look at that family, because sometimes you may have a single parent with 6 children. Sometimes you have a family that's, say, just above the poverty line. So, I mean, you might have, a very wealthy family, but both parents are working, and so they're not there a lot of the time. It's so many different things. That's why I think I think those guidelines are important. I think
Yeah.
I've come across parents who in fact believe that certain organizations aren't doing enough to place stringent enough restrictions. There are those parents who want you to come in with a handout and say, look at A, B, C, D, E, F, follow all of it. Don't ask any questions, just do it. I'm the expert, I'm the authority, I know what I'm saying. Do what I tell you. You have other parents who would go crazy if you were to say something like that to them, because they're
Mm.
absolutely opposed to
Yeah.
that method of of helping parents out. They really do not believe in you coming in from the outside, no matter how much of an authority you may be, and giving them restrictions. So I think that's another reason why some people find it very difficult when they just kind of see that list of guidelines. They find that it doesn't quite mesh with their lifestyle or maybe their family's values, or anything like that. I do always like to tell parents, as much as you can delay it, please try to do that as much as possible, because
Yeah.
again, there's nothing within that tech that can benefit your child more than the time that you spend with your child will benefit them. There's absolutely nothing. And again, if anyone is trying to sell you their product based on that argument that they will give you something, or that they will give your child something that you can't, it's an absolute lie. Because it's simply, you know, humanly, biologically, emotionally, physiologically, is just simply not true. The most important thing that a child needs when it's that little is, food and warmth, the right nutrition, and to have their parents there, to have that sense of emotional and psychological safety.
Sure. So, I mean, in order to summarize, I'd say it's difficult to quantify when
Absolutely.
does development end? I mean,
Sure. Oh,
going,
yeah.
yeah, because
And
I
when does
mean,
it begin? Because it
ah,
begins in
yeah,
some ways from the moment of conception, right?
yeah,
As soon as those cells kind of start forming and multiplying, and the child, we don't call it a child yet, but that entity starts to develop, the wheels are already turning and things are already starting to happen in a way, which is why, women's nutrition while they're pregnant is so important. Their stress levels are incredibly important, the support system they have around them. So really, when we're talking about child development, we're really talking about before the point at which they're born. You're talking about way before then, because of course everything that happens to the mother who's carrying the baby will then affect the baby as well.
yeah. I suppose in my case, my knowledge on child development is out of date, like probably like a few
Right.
decades out of date. Because I
Sure.
think when I think child development, I think Jean Piaget and
Sure.
Vygotsky and Bowlby's attachment theories, 1940s, and
Sure. And we
um,
still use them
yeah,
as the foundation, because they
yeah,
made, the same way that, by now we do absolutely talk about Freud as being outdated in so many ways.
sure,
But at the same time, there's certain elements of his theories and of his practice as well that, even when you think about it from this perspective, were incredibly revolutionary for that time and are
yeah,
still absolutely accurate. And so his emphasis, for example, when we talk about technology, one of the reasons why we use technology in all its different forms is that it can kind of help us manage our emotions. And I know that's something that you want us to talk about at one point as well. We use that technology either to numb ourselves or to reduce boredom, to
Yeah.
increase pleasure, and so on. And so Freud talked about, the pleasure principle. So much of his work revolved around that, and it's 100% accurate, because as human beings, we're built to avoid pain and go towards pleasure. It's really as simple as that. And then, of course, through evolution, as our environment got more complex, as we got more complex, as our kind of social interactions became more complex, how we defined pain and how we defined pleasure, and whether pain actually hurts or sometimes it can feel like pleasure, all that kind of got very messy. And in in today's world, it's incredibly messy. How do you define things that don't give you pleasure, and the ones that do? The line's very blurred. And because technology has kind of almost seamlessly been woven into the fabric of our lives, it's sometimes very difficult to separate those things out and to think in terms of how are we using tech, when it comes to trying to increase our levels of pleasure. So, and
Sure.
Freud was absolutely accurate about that. So I think a lot of the people who you mentioned did some really seminal work when it comes to this, and we do still absolutely use all of their theories and all of their ideas. Attachment is one thing that I've already mentioned. There are a lot of really exceptionally talented psychotherapists, psychologists, psychiatrists who really heavily rely on those theories of attachment, and especially people who work with clients who've gone through trauma, maybe severe abuse and things like that, PTSD. They really rely heavily on a lot of that information that's come out of that attachment field, because it can really help to really help people reclaim their lives, basically, especially in the aftermath of trauma.
Yeah, no, I mention those people in particular because, for example,
Yeah.
John Piaget, or I think it was Vygotsky, talks about, development spanning into teenagehood as well, and the fact that,
Yes.
and when we're talking about age restrictions, it's difficult
Yeah.
because do you talk about development of the schema, or are we talking about development of just the physical motor neuron,
Sure.
like this, the sensory development?
Yeah.
But you mentioned that in vision earlier, so I'm
Yeah.
presuming the American Pediatric Association
Yeah.
would be going off that guidelines, the minimum, the bare minimum, I'm presuming.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm kind of still frustrated that, UK haven't even bothered to give any sort of recommendation.
Right.
And I think
Right.
in your country's case, at least it's given something. And I feel like
Right.
that's the problem with research in the academic world at the moment. There's
Mm.
so much hesitation, and
Yeah.
it's costing a lot. And
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
in your case, you've already mentioned that each parent is each child's an individual,
Yeah.
and the tactics that you would undergo. Every person's unique, and
Yeah.
there would be sometimes resistance from parents who
That's right.
feel offended if you try and tell them how to raise their kid.
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
it's my kid. Why, how dare you, and stuff like that. So,
Yeah.
but if you were to give sort of an age restriction, like
Right.
are you in agreement with 0 to 2? I mean, Mary Eichen in her book, I think she mentioned like 0 to 5, or said just delay it as much as possible. Or
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I do agree with it. But I do see how difficult it can be for a lot of parents to
sure,
actually implement it. So yes, in terms of if a parent asks me for a recommendation when it comes to that, or for my opinion on that, which of course just about all of them do, every
yeah,
time I speak to them, that is always the recommendation I give. So really as late as possible, as much as you can delay it. One thing that I never kind of place any restrictions on will be things like FaceTiming with relatives. And at the moment, I live in New York City. I've lived in Singapore before. I'm used to living in very multicultural environments. I myself am a third culture kid, so I grew up away from my grandparents and aunts and uncles and nephews. And I. I'm almost kind of scared to imagine how different my relationship with all of them would have been if we had had Skype or FaceTime or just even texting.
mm,
The ways in which we had to communicate from where we were living, from where my family was living in the Middle East with my relatives in Eastern Europe, was just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, you wouldn't even believe it, and it wasn't even that long ago. It was maybe about 20 years ago. So I
mm,
think any kind of, again, it's this bigger conversation conversation about kind of humane technology that we're getting into now. What does it mean for technology to be humane? And I do have, I'm a member of the digital wellness community in New York, and well, the kind of the global community as well. And I do
Yeah.
have some colleagues who kind of refuse to call technology humane because they believe that human is one thing, technology is another thing. There's no such thing as humane technology. They're
Yeah.
two separate categories. And in some ways I agree with that, but my view is that since we do have technology now and we can't just magically erase it, let's look at the ways in which technology can be made to be more humane, and what does that actually mean. So in this case, if you are talking about a 6-month-old baby or a 2-year-old toddler, if they use FaceTime even on a daily basis, even for an hour every single day, but if they're using it to communicate with their with their cousins or with their grandparents, or whoever it is, with their mom or dad, if they're far away, I think that's absolutely a humane way in which we can use technology, in which technology really kind of feeds our human relationship and builds it. So, for example, it took me a very long time to convince my mother to get a smartphone because she just refused to get one, and she still doesn't quite know how to use it.
Hmm.
But her getting one has made a huge difference to our relationship because we're able to kind of contact each other anytime we want, and we're very close, so we think about each other a lot, and not being able to reach out to each other was almost painful,
Sure.
because we're so close. And so I think it's important also, in something that I do with parents a lot, is not, because when you go in straight away with those restriction and the age limits and all these things, parents get very defensive, understandably, because they think, oh, here comes that psychologist who's going to tell me off about all the ways,
Mm.
in which
Yeah.
I'm ruining my kid, or, whatever it is, I'm overstimulating them with technology, and so on. So one of the first things that I always like to do is to say, yes, these are the guidelines, and you want to try and stick within that range as much as you can, but let's look at what tech use actually looks like in your home. Let's look at what it is. And so if it is a day of tech every single day for, say, a 1.5-year-old, I'm then going to be curious about what form of tech is it, and if the answer I get is it's FaceTiming with grandma,
Yeah.
or it's FaceTiming with their cousins, especially if they're in different countries, maybe they're then helping them learn another language or whatever it is. That's a wonderful thing to do for your child, to expose them
Yeah.
to that and to build those relationships. So that's why it's not as simple as no tech before 2.
Sure.
Overall, I feel it needs to be that. But if there is some room for tech, let's look at what are the kind of the nicest, more humane, most kind of nurturing forms of tech that we can actually use, that will actually be really, really beneficial, and that will add on to your life, as opposed to kind of take away from it in whatever way.
Sure. So, I mean, going off what you've said, the challenge with trying to drive a change in attitude towards technology, a change in using it, is, well, who do you blame? Do you blame Silicon Valley for building
Right.
this culture? Do you blame
Sure.
capitalism?
Sure.
Does it go political?
Right.
And also, you
Right.
give an example about a parent with 6 kids. Like, I feel like it's human nature when you're stressed, you go for the
Of course.
easiest option. Let's
Of
just
course.
give the kid the tablet to keep
Sure.
him quiet,
Again, it's
you
it's
know?
it's the
Yeah.
avoiding of the pain, and it's the avoiding of the discomfort, and moving
Yeah.
towards whatever it is that's going to make your life easier. And I think, especially when we look at a lot of the research that's come from the US, and there was an article on this, I believe, in the New York Times, but I'm not 100% sure, a number of months ago now. They were talking about, the kind of the accessibility gap within technology, or the technology gap. What does it actually look like? And it's
Mhm.
not what we would expect. So in some cases it is. Again, this is such a nuanced, complex kind of topic. But on the one hand, you might think that people who don't have a lot of money have less tech and use less tech. People who have a lot of money have more tech, and they use more of it as well. It turns out that in a lot of parts of America, for example, the exact opposite is true. So what you're finding is that people who are wealthier, who are probably more educated, who are more exposed, for example, to our podcast and what we're talking about right now, they're
Yeah.
the ones who have a kind of a higher level of consciousness when it comes to the potential negative impacts of technology. And so they will go and say, I don't want my child to use this level of technology. Maybe they'll get some kind of parental control apps that they're going to purchase, or other forms of tech as well that can help them out with that, and that's going to be their story. When you look at people who are either kind of around the poverty line or just a little bit above it, if you're especially looking at a single parent, for example, who has two or three or four kids, they may not have quite as much money, but they will maybe be able to afford the one iPad or maybe a couple of smartphones for their kids. And if they're working, three shifts a day, who else is going to look after that child? And again, in America, there's a huge conversation around how expensive childcare is and so on. And so if they can't afford to have a nanny or, two nannies to take care of their five kids,
Yeah.
YouTube's going to do a much better job of doing that. And so that's where we're seeing that technology use gap, where we're seeing people who are not quite as well off, or the children who are in those families, they're the ones who tend to spend a lot more time on technology. And so then and using tech. So then we have to ask the questions of what is it that they're using, and is it, again, detrimental to them? Is it helpful to them? Is it helping them thrive? If they're if they're watching videos on YouTube about how to make things, or about geography, or about different cultures, or if they're able to use some kind of very simple, say, even messaging app to communicate with kids from different parts of the world, where again, they can kind of really become global citizens in that kind of a sense. That's a wonderful way and a really important way for those kids to have access to the kinds of things that more wealthier kids have. Oftentimes, though, we see that that's not the case, and that the tablet or the smartphone really is just being used as kind of a distraction, so that child is just kind of off and busy, and the parent can then go and earn the money that they need to earn in order to take care of those kids. So it is a very complex issue when we talk about who's to blame as well. I kind of like, again, because technology has infiltrated so many aspects of our lives, at this point, I feel that we're all responsible in the different kinds of ways in which we can impact this whole conversation. So one of the things that I always like to share, something that I've kind of trained myself to do, and I'm in Serbia at the moment. I'm originally from Serbia, but I spend most of my time in New York. And so I do this in New York. If I'm on the subway, or I'm on the streets, it's always very, very crowded, all kinds of people around you. If I notice that there are children around me, especially younger children, and I happen to be on my phone, I will always put the phone away. I'll always put it in my pocket, and I will make eye contact with that child. I will smile at them. Maybe I'll say something to them, whatever it is. So I feel responsible, as of course I do also because of the work that I do. So my level of awareness on this is maybe higher than your average person's. But I think we all need to carry that level of responsibility, that these kids are looking at all of us. They're not just looking at their parents. They're looking at passersby. They're looking at people in the shop. They're looking at people, at other parents in the playground, and they're watching us. And because they don't know what the rules are of life on this planet, whatever it is that we're doing, they figure, okay, I guess that's how it goes here. That's what we do. When we're on the street, we use our phones. When we're on the subway, we use our phones. When we're on the playground, we use our phones, or whatever else it is. And then they're going to accept that as the norm, and then they're going to start doing it as well. So I do feel like we all share the responsibility. They're just slightly different things that we can all do about these problems. So obviously governments can do one thing, advocates can do something else, psychotherapists can do something else, software engineers can do another thing, designers can do another thing, pediatricians can do something else, parents can do something else, teachers and schools play a huge role, because educational technology, so ed tech, has really infiltrated schools as well, and again, in not very kind of properly pre-thought kinds of ways. Again, it's a little bit of that. Let's just start using it and we'll see what happens. So I really do think we all share this responsibility. I don't think we're at a position where any one segment of society can just kind of cop out and say, well, I'll let them deal with it. I really don't think we can afford to do that. Not at this stage.
Sure. No, I totally agree with what you're saying. And it seems more practical to, if you give yourself the power to make that change. And
Sure.
because Jordan Peterson mentioned that our job as parents is kind of like help children to socialize and know what that means, and to then sort of learn to function within society, and
Yeah.
that could take up to 18 years, he
Yeah.
mentioned. And I suppose, yeah, you have to kind of lead through example in that sense. And in
Sure.
my case, something that I like to say about technology and the reason we use it is it's kind of, well, it's an outlet for information, it's an extension of
Sure.
our already existing
Yeah.
social interactions, not a replacement.
Sure.
And that's something that needs to be echoed, I feel. But
Sure.
and it's
Sure.
primarily a tool. So
Yeah.
as long as it stays that way and doesn't become like a fashion statement it is today, or kind of
Sure.
part of your identity, you know,
Sure.
because then, but I suppose the scope of our conversation is expanding way broader than just
This is true.
children, but it
Yeah.
is expanding quite a lot. But
Yeah.
I want to go back to and unpack a lot of what you said probably 20 minutes ago now,
Sure.
you know,
Sure.
because you mentioned, okay, so a lot, I mean, even in your TED Talks, echoed a lot is the concept of emotional intelligence. You mentioned it
Sure.
sort of in what you were
Yeah.
saying, and
Yeah.
there's sort of a danger that, you know, as a lot of people are worried that as we focus too much on technological development, there doesn't leave enough room to develop socially, to develop the
Sure.
social skills. So could
Yeah.
you, I mean, you mentioned emo diversity as
Yeah.
well. Could you
Yeah.
explain what this all means, and do you see this as important in the digital
Sure.
age?
Sure. So I do workshops on a number of different topics. One of them is digital wellness. Another one is emotional wellness. And even though they're separate topics, in the emotional wellness workshops that I deliver, within the first maybe kind of, I don't know, 3 to 5 minutes, I give my reason for why I believe that we really have to really become a lot smarter about our emotions now in this age than we have in the previous ones. And that is because of technology. It's because of the role that tech plays in our lives. And the historian Melvin Kranzberg famously said that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I think that's absolutely true when we talk about our emotions. Technology has the potential to create a pretty fair bit of emotional disbalance in all of our lives because of all the content that it holds. It can make us feel all sorts of different things. And I don't think we're in the habit really of being aware of our inner emotional life or of our inner emotional landscape and what that looks like and what kinds of emotions we actually want to be feeling on a daily basis. And so that plays a role in neurodiversity as well. So to begin with, the concept of emotional intelligence has been around since about 95, even before then really, but the first kind of book that was written about that by Daniel Goleman was written kind of around the mid 90s, and then since then we've been talking about it a lot in its most kind of basic terms. Like I said just now, emotional intelligence means being smart about our emotions, the same way that the kind of typical intelligence that we talk about means being smart about facts and data and the world in which we live. Emotional intelligence is really being smart about that inner world, that emotional world, which doesn't only encompass our emotions, but it's to do with our thoughts, it's to do with our behaviors as well, it's to do with other people too, so that we get a sense of how do other people make me feel and how do I impact other people emotionally. So really it's about building that intelligence on what we're feeling. A part of that is being emotionally literate, and so that's something I also talk about a lot. So it's really knowing and understanding how to name our emotions and how to differentiate them. The importance of
Yeah,
understanding that anger is anger, but there are lots of different kinds of anger, and there will be lower intensity types of anger, and then kind of mid intensity, and then just absolute, fuming and ranging. And kind of a wonderful resource, I think, for people who are joining us today, something to kind of to look up is called the Atlas of Emotions, which was created by the Ekmans, the father and daughter duo, who've been very well known in the emotional intelligence field for a very, very long time. They collaborated on that project with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and now they're actually working on a version for children. which is
Sure.
incredible. So that's what emotional intelligence is. It's really understanding our emotions, knowing how to name them. And then emo diversity is something that, like you said, I did a TEDx talk on that last year in Singapore. It was a concept that was relatively new to me at that point as well, and that was the reason why I chose to talk about it, because I wanted to kind of, through talking about it, learn more about it. And so the very international group of researchers who looked at this topic for the first time and found some really interesting results approached it from the perspective of biodiversity. And what they said was, when we look at the planet, the most biodiverse landscapes and environments seem to be the healthiest ones. So it looks like containing that diversity really means you get much greater health. So is the same true when it comes to our emotions? Having very diverse emotions, will that actually lead us to greater emotional and mental health? And some of their kind of earliest studies and their earliest ventures kind of looking into this seem to suggest the same thing. So what that means is that, again, we have this tendency to tend to try and kind of amplify our positive emotions and kind of stifle those negative ones, or the ones that don't feel very pleasant, that don't feel very comfortable. And so it seems like you would think that what that would mean is that, oh, that's great then, because we feel more good than we do bad. But it seems that that's not actually the case. So that if we try to repress a lot of our what we call our negative emotions, which, by the way, we can't get rid of. We can't stop feeling angry, and we can't stop feeling sad, and we can't stop feeling afraid. It's just simply impossible. Those emotions are kind of built into our brain. So we definitely can't not feel them. By repressing them and kind of pushing them away, all that means really is that they come back later, and usually in a much kind of stronger, more intense, much more distractive mode. So the idea with emo diversity is really to try and bring about a balance. If you can, on a daily basis, if not, then on a weekly basis, to try and make sure that you're trying to allow your negative or uncomfortable emotions to really play out their full course, to really understand what their function is, why they're there, what can I do about them, and then absolutely, on the other hand, to try and amplify your positive emotions. We definitely want to be doing that. So we need to understand, what are the different kinds of positive emotions that I want to be feeling this week? Do I want to experience awe? Do I want to experience gratitude? Do I want to experience excitement? Do I want to experience joy? What are the different forms of pleasure that I want to experience? And for me, the most important then thing when it comes to both emotional intelligence and emo diversity is that element of choice,
Mhm.
of really choosing how do you want to feel, because we tend to look at ourselves as being very passive creatures at the mercy of our kind of crazy, prehistoric ancient brains that are just kind of doing whatever they want with us. But again, a lot of research in the fields of positive psychology, in the field of gratitude, of awe as well, a lot of research on that coming out of the University of California at Berkeley, shows that we really do have a lot more power than we actually realize. And that is something that I teach in my positive psychology workshops. And again, I love combining that with emotional intelligence, with another concept called digital intelligence that I really love, that's only come about relatively recently, and think in terms of making decisions, making conscious choices about how do we want to feel, and then looking at technology and saying, well, how does it actually make me feel? How does Facebook make me feel? Or how does using Instagram make me feel in the way in which I
Sure.
use it right now? Which doesn't mean you necessarily have to stop using it. All it can maybe mean is making a couple of tweaks, literally changing the people who you follow. There was a recent study that was done by a women's focused charity, and I'm sorry now that I can't remember what it's called, but they looked into teenage girls and how they could tweak their use of Instagram. And so they didn't ask them to unfollow anybody. They just asked them to follow more of the types of women who they're interested in, who do the kind of work that's in the fields that they're maybe curious about. And after a couple of weeks, they found really incredible things in terms of how these girls' perspectives changed. And a few of them even said, I didn't realize you could use social media in this kind of a way. I thought that wasn't what it was about. I thought it was about influencers and beauty vloggers and likes and and all the filters and all these different things, but I didn't realize that you could, for example, follow a Michelle Obama and that you could learn all these things from her, or that you could
Mm.
follow Brene Brown and learn these things from her, and all these, and young women who are in sports, who are in, say, the military, who are in science, whatever it is that you're interested in. So sometimes that's all it can take for us to really bring in a lot more emotional intelligence into our life and really decide how we want to feel.
Fantastic. No, what made me want to ask that particular question was because, when I watched your talk, your TED talk, you
Right.
mentioned at the age of 2, you left what was formerly known as Yugoslavia to
Yeah.
go to
Yes.
Sweden, and
Yes.
you felt
Yeah.
this burning sense of responsibility and pressure to put on a brave face in front of your
Sure.
parents, to not
Sure.
worry then. And that
Yeah.
resonated with me a little, and the concept of being more diversity, because you
Sure.
know looking at my mid-20s now, I'm more conscious of the fact that I'm capable of experiencing more than one emotion at any
Yeah.
given time, and I
Yeah.
can label them more accurately. But in
Sure.
your teens and in your
Yeah.
child development, you just kind
Yeah.
of feel things. You
Sure.
don't know how to say it. You don't know how
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
articulate it, and that's what's so frustrating, I
Yeah.
found.
Absolutely.
And in my case, when I was younger, sometimes I'd feel down, and I wasn't sure how to express that. So then,
Sure.
and then I'd just express it indirectly, or I'd just bury myself in video games and just game for
Sure.
hours.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
given my example, that
Hmm.
it's just so easy just to scratch yourself with especially with the graphics games I have, and the
Yeah.
fact that it's so enticing. I'm wondering,
Sure.
do you reckon it will become more of a trend now that children today will look to digital distraction instead of emotional vulnerability because it's easier? And
Right.
you think
Sure.
technology is enabling that habit, that defense mechanism?
Yeah, yeah. I think again, something that the idea that we've touched upon already, which is this whole avoidance of pain and a seeking of pleasure. I think when it
Sure,
comes
sure.
to that, we've always looked for ways to do that. Teenagers have always looked for ways to do that because, like you
Yeah.
said, when you're a teenager, you're all up in your emotions,
Yeah.
and there's a brain-based reason for that. And again, I would encourage people to read Brainstorm by Dr. Dan Siegel. He wrote that book with the idea of teenagers and adults reading it as well. So it's a very teenage friendly book as well. And he goes into that really nicely, why it is that our emotions are so intense when we're teenagers. And the way that you hate when you're a teenager is never going to be as intense again. The way you love when you're a teenager is never going to be the same again.
Mm.
It's incredibly intense, and it's all because of the way your brain's developing. And so those kind of the mid portions of our brains, the very deep portions that we tend to think about as kind of the emotional centers, are very powerful, very active. The frontal part of our brain, that's more kind of the executive center, the control center, doesn't finish developing until we're about 25.
Yeah.
And so, of course, as teenagers, we don't know what in the world is going on. We don't know how to use the words to express what's going on, and it's not a new thing that teenagers will tend to withdraw and either kind of pull into themselves or go and kind of exclusively talk to their friends and talk to their peers kind of about what is going on. So I think in terms of that, again, it's very important to normalize that. It's not a kind of a sudden kind of a parenting crisis. This has always been going on. It's just
Sure.
the question is kind of how have we numbed our senses in before, or how have we tried to withdraw or to avoid, and how are we able to do it now? And so I think when it comes to that, given how accessible our technology is, and seamless is the word that designers and software engineers often like to use.
Yeah.
User friendly, seamless, blends in, you don't even notice it's there, which by the way, I don't think that we should be striving for that. I think we should strive for the exact opposite. You want your tech to really stick out like a sore thumb, so that you're aware of it, so that you can then position it wherever you want it to be in your life, not so that it kind of infiltrates every aspect of it. But I think given how technology is designed, and given kind of the nearly complete lack of control that we have over the internet and the dark web and all of that, there is some cause for concern, to do with that question, exactly what you were saying. So the teenagers of today and tomorrow and in 10, 20 years, what are they going to be withdrawing into, and what are the coping mechanisms that they're going to be using in order to try and make sense of these intense things that they're going through, especially again if we look at how technology is developing, what some of the future trends are. So having those kind of personalized robots, VR. I think VR, as amazing as it can be for so many things. Surgery, for example. I mean, med students can use VR in incredible ways to really practice their craft and perfect it. If you're looking at a teenager who is, say, 14 or 15, who's experiencing, intense amounts of fear or shame or loneliness.
Sure.
VR is a very, very easy kind of just one step away world that they can dive right into, and for very good reasons, not ever want to get back out. Because, like you said, it's stimulating, it's engaging, it's enticing, it pulls you in. You feel good, at least for a little bit, right? Which is why a lot of times we get hooked to things like sugar and tech and drugs and all these other things. They make us feel good. They kind of initiate that whole pleasurable chain reaction. And so I think in terms of the phenomenon itself, in terms of teenagers developing in the way that they do, and having that need to pull back a little bit, I don't think that's any cause for alarm, because it's perfectly developmentally normal. But I think we need to be concerned about, what are the ways in which they're going to be doing that? How are they going to seek to alleviate some of that pain and experience a little bit more pleasure? And again, I think because of the way in which technology is developing, I think it is, again, all the more important for teachers, for parents, relatives, coaches, whoever spends time with kids, to really take that time to observe them, to watch them, to get a sense of what these kids' needs are. Because, as we all know, there are lots of ways to fulfill and satisfy our needs. Some of them are wonderful, others are really, really bad, sometimes just kind of downright dangerous and unhealthy.
Yeah, no, I think the reason I asked that is because it's more of a personal one, because I feel personally that I looked to technology when I was younger as a form of escapism,
Sure.
literally, like, because
Yeah.
that was I just binge watch loads of TV shows way before Netflix time,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
even play loads of games 6 to 8 hours, not become conscious of what I was eating or when I
Yeah.
was eating, and then because it was so easy to do, and
Yeah.
I almost had this kind of weird depersonalization feeling where I got so into the game that
Yeah.
afterwards I felt like just very numb and lethargic. And then, but I
Absolutely.
wasn't conscious. I didn't really care at that
Yeah.
time. But I feel
Yes.
like
Yeah.
because it happened to me, and then I had to realize the negative consequences, of which I realized happened years later, that I'd become
Sure.
less socially aware, less
Yeah.
emotionally intelligent. And then I had to, well, luckily I studied psychology to kind of unpack the ways I'm
Yeah.
insane. So,
Sure.
yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
probably the reason why I wanted to
Yeah.
ask that. It's more of a
Absolutely.
personal thing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think your example, again, by the way, we've been escaping into entertainment-based forms of technology forever. That's why we have the professions of
Yeah,
acting and singing and, but performing in all sorts of ways. It is a really magical thing to have that hour and a half or 2 or 3 hours,
yeah,
where you can watch something happen right before your eyes. For example, last night they had Gladiator on TV, and I think I watch it every single time that it comes on, because it's just there is some magic in that, really, to be able to have a piece of history or a story like that belongs to somebody else be a part of your life for those few hours. And again, I think there's something very beautiful in that. So I think, again, we have to be careful to not pathologize kind of the whole thing, to
mm,
understand why it's so enticing, and why a teenager such as yourself, or anybody else, would really seek that level of escapism or of pleasure, or, again, of whatever it is. But I think that's why it's important for the adults in all of these kids' lives to have an awareness of some of these trends and some of these patterns, and understand kids in that developmental sense, so that the next time it happens, maybe an adult who's around can have that conversation and say, this is why you love this so much, this is why you find it so enticing, but we need to talk about how you're going to use it and how you're going to engage it. And if you do feel that it is escapism, what is it that you're escaping from, and how can we help you make your reality better, so that you don't want to escape from it in quite the same way.
exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think we kind of look to the imagination to kind of excite our lives if there's no other option,
Sure.
or
Yeah.
looks, and technology becomes a nice outlet for imagination. But then
Yeah.
I find the bridge between imagination and reality is creativity. And that's
Sure.
something I discovered later on. I just kind of wish that I learned that earlier, so that
Right.
way I didn't just put all my eggs in one basket, because it
Sure.
made a huge difference. Going to the gym, playing a musical instrument, doing finding other ways of entertainment is very empowering. Because as a
Yeah.
teenager, you're just so bored,
Oh, yeah.
frustrated,
Sure.
and you don't know how to
Absolutely.
handle it.
Sure,
So
yeah, absolutely. And what you've also said, when you compare these different things like, well, real world activities, basically, you're talking about being physically active in the gym, or you're talking about being physically and mentally and emotionally active when you're playing an
yeah,
instrument. All of these activities stimulate all of the senses. And there's this concept that I came across literally, I think maybe 4 or 5 days ago, called aesthetic intelligence, which I find incredibly interesting. And it's kind of it's a new field, and it's not a new field for me. It's a brand new concept. And I had the opportunity to meet the author of a new book called Aesthetic Intelligence, Pauline Brown, and I got to speak with her a little bit about aesthetic intelligence, and again how it fits into emotional intelligence, and how it fits into digital intelligence as well. And something that she talks about is the fact that when we're looking at our digital experiences, which often tend to be screen based, at most they're stimulating about 1.5 of our senses. And so a lot of the time you do end up becoming kind of numb. So like you were saying, you kind of come out of it feeling lethargic and feeling kind of numb, and in this very kind of strange physical
yeah,
state. And then when you compare that to being in these other states, like playing a musical instrument, or being in the gym, or for other people it can be going to a gallery, or it can be the way she described aesthetics, and the way she does in her book, which I've just started reading and I'm loving it already, is that aesthetics isn't actually just about how things look. It's so much more than that. It's that whole experience. It's about, how does something you engage with make you feel? How
yeah,
does it make you, what does it make you think? How does it make you relate to other people? And so I love that example that you gave or that contrast really of a digital based experience, and
yeah,
how tired that made you feel. And
yeah,
I've found at least part of the answer to that in this concept of aesthetic intelligence, and the fact that all of these tech based experience they overstimulate some of our senses, and they severely understimulate others. And I think that's one of the problems that we have, and one of the dangers inherent in exposing children to way too much technology in a mindless way very early, is that you're playing around with how their senses are being stimulated. And again, we know that we need to develop all of our senses in a healthy way in order to then become healthy adults one day.
yeah. Upon reflection, I found it empowering to have those other options, and
Right.
it was only until I discovered the German word Weltschmerz that I actually
Right.
understood what I was going through. Because I felt like that one word, which just kind of goes back to emo diversity,
Yeah,
totally
absolutely.
explained what I'm
Sure.
experiencing. Like, because I'd
Yeah.
get so entrenched in my world. And
Yeah.
Weltschmerz, for those who don't know, is the depression which arises when your imaginary world does not meet the expectation of the real world,
Yeah.
basically. And I
Yeah.
felt like I was having an online Weltschmerz, whereas like I was
Yeah.
engaged in my game for ages. I felt like I was making progress, but then nothing would change my real life. So then that kind of realization was a bit daunting, which made me want to
Yeah.
go back into the game again. But then I feel
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
with virtual reality and all
Mm.
these things, making it even more like you can actually achieve your imagination and get like
Yeah.
immerse yourself in a different world that's created
Sure.
for you. I
Sure.
feel like that temptation is going to be way higher, because we're actually going to, because with games these days you can actually even have augmented reality where you're interacting, in a zombie
Yeah.
game or something like that, and it's
Sure.
just
Sure.
it's amazing, like the kind of games out there as well. And yeah,
Yeah.
like that one word Weltschmerz, and I'm really fascinated by it, and
Sure.
I kind of relate to what you're saying about being able to label your experiences, and even the English language is limited, and you have to
Oh,
go to other
absolutely.
languages
You have
to
to go. Yeah,
kind
and
of,
I'm so glad
yeah,
you brought that up, because I'm familiar
yeah,
with that concept, but I haven't come across it in a very, very long time.
yeah,
And so I'm glad that you brought it up, because I think that all of us are experiencing that Weltschmerz when it comes to, even if you're not a gamer per se, even if all that you're engaging with is, say, Instagram, and we all know this by now, there's a huge discrepancy between what life on this planet looks like according to Instagram,
Yeah.
as opposed to what life actually looks like. So I think that if some alien based life form came down and said, what does life look like here, and we showed them Instagram, they would be very much deceived in terms of what our lives actually look like. And so I think that what you're explaining probably happens in a kind of micro dosed kind of way to
Yeah.
all of us kind of all the time, right? Because when it comes to social media, it's not made for us to depict the difficult aspects of our lives, or the difficulties we have in relationships, all the moments we kind of doubt ourselves. We're supposed to put on that filter and look really good and sound really smart and look like we have it all together. And then again, what happens when you switch that off, and when you go back in your real world? There has to always be that discrepancy, which of course increases then when you're using virtual reality, augmented reality, when you're in that gaming world.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other conversation too. Boys in particular, according to research, tend to use technology primarily for games. For girls, it seems to be more music based. So girls, it seems, mostly
Sure.
use it for that reason. Boys are using it for that reason. And I think one of the other topics that I feel very strongly about, and that I talk about a lot and write about a little bit too, is how the kind of the gender-based differences in terms of how we parent our boys and how we parent our girls. And I talk about it a little bit in the TEDx talk as well. But we tend to raise our boys with a lot less emotional intelligence, kind of from the get-go. And like you were saying, you had an awareness of maybe only one emotion for a very long time, and you didn't
Yeah.
know that, oh, I can feel, there's all these different things I can feel. We tend not to permit boys to feel too many things. It's
Yeah.
it's very gender appropriate for boys to exhibit anger. But it isn't for girls, and so we'll try and stifle girls from expressing anger, whereas boys not so much. And so then what you have is this whole population of boys who are not in touch with their emotions, who are not aware of them, and who will just take that detour into virtual reality. And then you're going to lose them, because then they're off,
Yeah.
and like you said, it's very hard to get them back in, because why would they want to? The real world stimulates all of their senses, and it's all very confusing, whereas over there it's very focused on one or two of them, and most of it is very pleasure based, most of it is very, very reward based. So why not just stay in that world, regardless of how tired I feel afterwards and lethargic? I don't actually care, because I don't want to be a part of this world anyway. So I don't care if I'm tired when it's the real world. So I think again, there's somewhere kind of we're expanding the story again now, but I think it's really important for parents, as they think about how they parent their boys and how they parent their girls, and how, as these kids are growing, they're engaging with technology. We know that boys and girls don't use tech in quite the same ways. So I think that's kind of another layer to the story, kind of another thing that we really need to keep an eye out for, and really, again, for parents to really educate themselves and to understand some of these different patterns, in terms of how boys and girls are using technology.
Definitely. So I suppose going back to kind of the original point in terms of child development and the bond parents form with their children,
Yeah,
um, I just want to be able to accurately list what are the actual consequences if we say if a parent just decides, okay, I'm just give
sure.
my toddler at 1 years old a tablet. What are the consequences of that in terms of interrupted bonding process? Keep in mind that, Bowlby's attachment theory talks about how if that bond is interrupted, that could lead to
Sure.
trauma later on in
Sure.
life, could lead to
Yeah.
development of narcissism and all kinds of stuff. Like, in your
Yeah.
opinion, your
Yeah.
perspective, what do you
Yeah.
think is the consequences of interrupting this
Sure.
process using technology?
Sure, sure. There's one line of research that I think shows that in a really wonderful way, and it's been replicated a number of times. Most recently, it's been done by a woman called Dr. Tracy Dennis Tawari, who is a colleague and a friend of mine. She's also based in Manhattan, and she's kind of replicated what's called the still face experiment. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
Yeah.
this was done, I think, in the 60s or 70s, maybe, where parents were instructed to just keep a very, very still face, not show any emotion while their children are interacting with them, so that we could observe what does this do to kids, how does their behavior change. So what Tracy did was she repeated the same kind of experiment, but what she had parents do was look at their phones. and they were instructed to look at their phones and not look away no matter what their child was doing around them for a certain kind of number of minutes.
Hmm.
And Diane Sawyer interviewed her about this, and they did a kind of small replication for the sake of the show. And it's very painful to watch. For anyone who hasn't seen it, I would encourage them to go on YouTube and look at that, because you can actually see kind of the answer to the question that you've just asked me. You can see that initially a child will try to connect, so it will try to
Yeah.
attach, and there's one little boy who's trying to get his mom to leave the room with him, and he keeps saying, "Mommy, mommy, we're going now, we're leaving now, look, mommy." And then he tries to model the behavior to her. So then he
Hmm.
starts moving away, he starts walking in the direction of the door, and then he keeps verbally engaging, "Mommy, we need to go now, we need to leave the room, mommy, mommy, you're not paying attention to me." Then he starts slowly getting kind of angry, and then he starts getting kind of upset with her and telling her how he's dissatisfied. Then he goes and he grabs, so you see that there's this hope and there's this
Yeah.
effort, and then there's an attempt to connect and reconnect. Then there's an attempt to guilt trip, "Mommy, you're not paying attention to me, you're not paying attention to me." And after a certain period of time, what we notice, and this has been replicated with animals, even with dogs, you just stop trying, because there's no point. And that's something we call learned helplessness in psychology. And Martin Seligman, who's considered to be the founder of the positive psychology field, has used that as a model for depression. That's how he describes depression, as
Sure.
just a giving up. And so those are the kinds of things that, and again, I don't want to alarm parents. This is
Sure.
not something that will happen if you allow your child any amount of time on a screen-based device. It's absolutely not. We're talking about things that we need to keep in mind and that we need to keep in consideration, and things that can happen if children and parents rely on technology too much. So you see that your child will attempt to make that contact with you, that connection with you, and that they're not going to be able to do that, and eventually they may well give up. In which case that kind of the importance and the vitality of that parent-child connection will start to deteriorate, and the
Sure.
quality of the relationship will start to worsen. And so the implications for that are many. It could be that eventually children will develop certain types of personality disorders, like you said, narcissistic personality disorder. There are other types, such as avoidance personality disorder, a bunch
Yeah.
of other ones. It can definitely be things like their social emotional intelligence. So we need to learn that from our parents. Primarily, we need to observe what they do with other people, and then we learn how they do it, and then we replicate it. Things like empathy. If kids are not shown empathy, there's no way for them to learn then how to empathize. So you're talking about kids who will maybe have issues with empathizing. You will definitely have kids who have issues making eye contact. A lot
Hmm.
of teachers, even university professors, are starting to report that kids are just not able to maintain eye contact. If you're not able to establish or maintain eye contact, you definitely can't develop emotional intelligence, because so much of our emotions are conveyed through our faces. We have over 40 facial muscles, all of which we use in order to communicate to each other. "I'm angry with you," or "I'm happy." "I'm quite chilled," "I'm relaxed," "I'm indifferent." "I'm very angry," "I'm
Mm.
disappointed," "I'm scared," "I'm a threat to you," "I'm safe to. There's so many different things that we
Sure.
communicate through our faces and our bodies. If a child is not able to connect to their parent because of the device that's inserted in between, a child doesn't learn these rules. You can almost think of them as algorithms in a sense as well. I like to give another kind of tech-based metaphor when it comes to that. Our roles as the parents and the caretakers of children is to teach them about, if this happens in the world, then that happens. We're giving them all the rules for how
Sure.
to live life. And if you insert that device in between, children can't really develop that. One of the other things that we're hearing about a lot is loneliness, this loneliness epidemic. So again, the more that parents engage and withdraw into their devices, the more the child is going to do that as well. And so you're getting a very lonely child who's quite isolated and who doesn't quite has kind of given up on connecting with others. Anxiety is something else that, again, university professors, a few with whom I've spoken in New York, have said that they will sometimes get in their freshman year of university kids who are not capable of presenting, say, a PowerPoint presentation with a little bit of text. They will bring a note from their doctor saying that because they experience very high levels of anxiety and stress, they're excused from doing any kind of presentation based work.
Yeah.
Um, so so there are a lot of different things that can really, again, I don't say this to alarm anybody, and I don't say this to make parents feel like, oh my God, I've broken my child now. You
Sure.
really haven't. The wonderful thing about children and the parent-child connection is that there's always room for repair. Even when we're in our 30s or 40s or 50s, we can still repair our relationship with our parents. If we weren't able to create those changes, none of us in the field of psychotherapy would be working. There'd be no point for our existence. So there's always room for repair, but we need
Mhm.
to know what are the kind of almost the worst case scenarios so that we understand why it's so important that we really are available to our kids, that we're accessible to them, that we're highly responsive to them, that we really pay attention to them. Because again, when you're born into this world, you have no concept of yourself. How else do we know that we are until somebody else sees us?
Exactly.
Until somebody else tells us you're an actual human being with a name and with a personality and with needs, and I'm going to come and I'm going to meet your needs, and I'm going to soothe them when you need me to, and I'm going to feed you when you're hungry. It's such such an incredibly important relationship. It's often hard to summarize it because there's so many facets of why a parent is the most special person in a child's life. They make you feel as though you matter, and they make you feel like a human that exists in this world that's worthy of being alive. A sense of worth is also highly connected to that attachment with a parent. If a parent is constantly inaccessible and if a parent is constantly absent, a child cannot develop their sense of worth. So you're going to end up with an adult who has a very low sense of worth, low self-esteem. It feels like an imposter. And again, when we look at boys, for example, we know that can lead to a lot of behavioral problems when and usually they come out in the form of aggression, because again, for boys, it's not acceptable for them to show vulnerability. It's a
Mhm.
lot more acceptable for them to show aggression, and so that's
Yeah.
often how it comes out.
Definitely. It's refreshing to know, it's a stage of continual development that we can
Absolutely.
change it even if we do make mistakes, which is good
Exactly.
because obviously there's a lot of parents who may be over preparing and over analyzing it, and they're
Yeah,
super afraid of getting it wrong, and we
absolutely.
don't want to cause people to be
No,
more anxious and just don't
absolutely
bother
not.
with parenting altogether.
Exactly. Yes.
So
No,
yeah.
no, absolutely not.
Exactly. We looked at the psychological, emotional consequences.
Mm.
Um, One observation from my cousin, who is a teacher at a primary school, he noticed that kids are learning English a lot slower for some
Right.
reason. That's what he noticed. He
Right.
noticed that
Sure.
to pick up literacy,
Right.
for some reason, nowadays he was blaming it on, like, say, texting and
Sure.
like kids having access to phones really early, so the form of like English grammar is not
Right.
as strictly adhered to and practiced.
Sure. Yes.
So what are your
Yes.
thoughts on that? Do you think that's a consequence as well of
Yeah, absolutely. I think since I'm not a teacher, I don't have that level of access with kids when it comes to their ability to learn. But
yeah,
again, I've heard from plenty of teachers who make these same comments about children's ability, not just to learn, subjects such as math or English literacy and things like that, but also their social and emotional intelligence. So there are a lot of
okay, we're back. Looks like we had an issue with the battery. So yeah, almost.
speaking of technology.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, bound
So
to happen.
exactly. So, but yeah, just so time flies when you're talking through these deep topics. But
Yeah.
yeah, I believe you were talking about literacy and how
Yes.
technology may affect that. You want to?
Yes. Yeah. There have been some observations made by and again, both, teachers in a kind of kindergarten level all the way up to teachers in high school and then professors as well.
Sure.
Um, Noticing some of these changes in the ways that children or young adults pay attention, the ways in which they focus, the ways in which they interact with each other, and the ways in which they learn as well. And so again, I'm hearing that from a lot of kind of different level teachers saying that the kids who are coming in are not ready to kind of meet the demands of those kind of developmental levels that they're at. So when it comes to younger kids, like, kindergartners, things like the level of social and emotional intelligence that they should have at that point, some of the levels of independence that they should have, they're not really there. And then, like you said in your example, the ability to learn English, to learn the kind of the grammatical structure of the English language is disrupted. And then when it comes to maybe older kids, so when we're talking about teenagers or young adults, their ability to regulate their emotions, so that ability to kind of self-soothe and manage your own emotions is not quite there. Some psychologists, some researchers will very quickly point to technology as being, I don't know, the only reason for that, or maybe the main reason for that. I think it is a little bit maybe premature to say that. I think that technology definitely plays a huge role in it, but again, I don't want that to be kind of like a a panic button with which we then kind of freak parents out and again make them feel as though they've ruined their kids. But I think it definitely is a cause to look at the role that technology plays in children's lives, and again, is it actually helping them, or is it hindering them? Because again, if you do end up with a 7 or 8 or a 9-year-old who's been using technology so much and has been maybe texting so much or writing so much on a screen-based device on which he's exclusively used abbreviations and emojis and so on, and is
Yeah.
then not able to speak whatever their language is, then that's definitely cause for concern, because then that child is not ready to meet those demands, of learning a language at the age of 7, 8, or 9. And again, going back to the concept of humane technology, in my mind, that is not humane technology then,
Sure.
because it's not really enhancing kind of the natural given talents of that child. Of course, we all have the talent to speak, and to use different types of languages. I, for one, absolutely love emojis. That's one of my kind of my favorite sort of, I don't know if you can call it an innovation within the tech world, but to
Mm.
me, that's one of the greatest gifts of the tech world, and I love using them a lot, because I think they can be used really. They can be used in cute ways and funny ways, in very emotionally appropriate and accurate ways, where, again, a picture speaks 1,000 words, where you can send one emoji and the person will know exactly what you're trying to say. But I think it's very different if those of us who are adults now, as adults, adopt those
Mm.
emojis, having learned either one or more languages, as opposed to, say, a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old who is from the get-go using those characters, let's say, or symbols, instead of actually using words or letters, or whatever it is. So again, I think it's, for me, I prefer to look at it not as a kind of reason to panic and to criticize necessarily, but to
Sure.
really look at it as a call to being a lot more mindful about how our children are using tech. And again, but if by the age of about 7 or 8 or 9, a child is not quite able to learn a language, and otherwise they're kind of developmentally perfectly fine, a parent will be able to notice by that point that, okay, there's something not quite right with the way my kid is interacting with technology. It obviously is way too much at this point if they're not able to speak or write their mother tongue in the right kind of a way. And then that would definitely be cause to try and kind of change that relationship a little bit, and try and change the child's habits around tech.
I see. So, yeah, I suppose echoed a lot in this conversation is the idea of a tailored approach,
Yeah,
that,
sure.
one guideline will not suit every single person.
Of
And I
course.
suppose on the extreme end, when you look at the DSM,
Right.
Diagnostic Statistic Manual for Mental Health,
Yes.
they do try to label people with a certain condition, like it's been
Sure.
talked about, recognizing internet addiction as an
Sure.
actual diagnosable condition
As
and
a disorder. Yeah.
as a disorder. And there's always been a critique about this approach, and
Yeah.
I could sort of guess what you'd have to say about that, but
Yeah.
I want to know, I don't want to assume, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure.
Is it helpful for parents to try and figure out, okay,
Sure.
does my son have internet addiction? Does my son have
Right.
gaming addiction? Is it helpful to use those terms?
Right, right. Uh, there has been a lot of debate. First of all, there's been a lot of debate on the DSM in itself. It's
Sure.
in its fifth edition now. There's always been a debate about the DSM and how useful is it, how helpful is it for those of us, especially who don't work as psychiatrists, who prescribe medicine, but those of us who use talk therapies, so psychotherapists. I think we've always had issues with it because when you work with people that closely, you know that you can have 5 people come in who suffer from depression, and of course they will have overlaps, but each person's depression will look very, very different, and so the approach has to be a little bit different too. So I think the whole issue of having the DSM in that form, people debate it a lot, and there's no agreement on that. When it comes to using the word addiction, there's also a huge amount of debate. And so I always like to again give the balanced kind of diplomatic answers to everything. Again, because I'm not a researcher myself, and so I
Yeah.
can't make claims about whether it is or isn't accurate to kind of depict. Tech addiction or internet addiction as an addiction. I think for things like that, we really do need to look to the scientists, to the neurologists, to the neuroscientists, and so on, and neuropsychologists who really, really know the ins and outs of what it means to be addicted. The issue again with that also is the fact that there are different forms of addiction. So there are more chemical based addictions. There are more behavior based addictions, and so when we talk about being addicted to technology or the internet, some of the people who are against using that word will say, addictions are based on chemicals. There's a chemical reaction there, so that if you smoke, there's a chemical reaction there. If it's even
Sure.
an intake of sugar, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, whatever it is, there are very kind of concrete, definable things going on. When you're talking about the internet, obviously it doesn't look like that. It's very different. For me, I don't believe that should be the reason for us to not look at it as
Sure.
potentially addictive behavior. And then again, similar to something that I've said earlier, for me personally anyway, I don't necessarily need to have a manual or a research study that's going to tell me, yeah, addiction definitely exists. For me, it's really enough to speak to people who have themselves been addicted, or to talk to parents who will report very, very troubling behavior from their kids, which look exactly like addictions of other kinds. And so we don't necessarily have to use the word addicted, or we don't necessarily need to enter it into the DSM. But I think in terms of the behavior that we're describing, you're definitely talking about addiction. And we know that there have been a few cases. This was in South Korea, I think, where one young boy died because he had been playing for whatever number of hours. He was wearing diapers. He hadn't gone to the bathroom. He had all
Hmm.
his food delivered to him there. So if you're talking about an addiction, we're talking about voluntary really versus involuntary behavior in a sense, right? You're hooked, you're addicted, you're attached. That sounds a lot like hooked, addicted, and attached behavior, right? Because you would assume that your kind of typical person who's not addicted would probably not do that to themselves, right?
Sure.
Because in a way you are talking about self-harm. You're talking about behavior that is self-harming you. There's no way that feels good in the way that petting a puppy can look good, or holding your baby can look good, or having an amazing time with your best friend can feel good. We're not talking about the same types of pleasure. Like I said, there are different ways in which we can meet our needs and our needs for pleasure. So and again, the same as a lot of other disorders. For example, when we look at PTSD, um, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of soldiers who go into all kinds of conflicts on a monthly basis, kind of depending on what period of history you look at. Not every single soldier will come back with PTSD, for example. And
Sure.
so and so it's not a disorder that anybody who is exposed to conflict or trauma will experience. So obviously there's something there that we also need to look at. It won't be everybody. And so a lot of the research now in PTSD, for example, is trying to find those markers. So can we predict who are the people who are going to suffer from this, so that maybe in some way we can help them beforehand. The same is true of this addictive type behavior when it comes to tech use. Not every single person who uses technology will become addicted, but it is very clear that some of them will. And so, like you said, it is very important, again, to know your child, to observe your child. If you're seeing that they're really not able to control themselves, and if they're starting to build up these very harmful in some cases, not very helpful, repetitive behaviors or habits when it comes to tech. And their behavior is very intense when you try and take it away from them. Sometimes they will maybe self-harm. Sometimes maybe they will harm others. They may go for long periods of time without sleeping, without eating, without going to the bathroom. They might end up getting ill. Personal hygiene will suffer. All these different things. That is some cause to kind of stop and look at their behavior overall, and then maybe also ask for help, or at least speak to somebody to get a little bit of advice at least. So again, my answer is I both kind of agree with it and disagree with it. I don't think we
Sure.
necessarily need to have, or I personally in my work don't need to have a manual in order to be able to kind of detect addiction in any form. But I'm not completely crazy about using that word, addiction. Although again, you are starting to see certain centers around the world, in the U.S. in particular, that will deal with internet addiction in particular. And I think there's been a few documentaries about them as well. Again, when you listen
Hmm.
to mostly these young men, because it's mostly young men who suffer from this. When you listen to their stories and their experiences, if they weren't using the word internet or game, you could easily assume they're talking about cocaine, or that they're talking about high sugary foods, or any of those other, again, substances that we tend to get hooked on. The internet and technology are a bit different because they're not a substance in that sense. But what I always like to say to parents as well is, please think about technology as something you consume, as something that
Sure.
your child consumes. Think about it in terms of a kind of digital nutrition. And there are other people, experts around the world who use this approach, in talking about tech use. Think about it in terms of those parameters, because that can really help you then manage your intake, basically, same as with food.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a podcast I had earlier this year was with Dr. Dustin Wiseman, who has opened his own rehabilitation
Sure.
center and clinic for internet addiction. But even he said, the key word is balance. He doesn't like to use the
Sure.
word addiction. It's more
Yes.
like optimizing your use of technology. But
Yeah.
from what you're saying, it seems it's good to have that option of the DSM-5,
For sure.
because if
Yeah.
they go through you first, you
Yeah.
can assess, okay,
Yeah.
is this an extreme case, and then
Sure.
signpost to them so that
Yeah.
they can deal with extreme cases. But I guess
Exactly.
for some people, they like, because they have the option, they want to go straight and quickly signpost to the medical, because they
Sure.
prefer the psychiatry paradigm over the
Absolutely.
psychology
Yeah.
paradigm. And I think,
Yeah.
well, from their perspective, like in hospitals, it's
Mm.
easy if you have a label to then
Yeah.
section them to someone else who can get treatment quicker. Like from an efficient operations point of view, it makes sense logistics wise, and how it works overall as a system,
Absolutely.
as a
Yeah.
structure.
Yeah. Again, there
So
there are differences, kind of like what I was saying earlier in terms of parents. Some parents want to get a kind of prescription for tech, a kind of digital prescription.
yeah,
Others really don't. They don't like that idea. And so I think when you look at adults who struggle with different types of mental health issues, you will have people who really prefer to have a diagnosis. They prefer to be diagnosed, to kind of put a name to whatever it is that's going on with them. They have no issue with saying, I suffer from depression, or I suffer from anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder. And then they want to be able to go in, they want to take medication, they want, they kind of want it all out in the open, and they want that label. They want to be clear about what it is. For
yeah,
other people, they really are very uncomfortable with that. They don't want to be labeled, they don't want to be diagnosed, they don't want to be put in a room with other people who have whatever it is that they have. They don't
yeah,
like that concept. Maybe they're against taking pills for any of the issues they have. They only want to do meditation, or they only want to do yoga, or they only want to do psychotherapy. It could be a number of different things.
mhm,
So that's why I think in a sense it is useful to have that manual.
yeah,
But we need to remember that not everyone's a fan of that, and maybe not everybody else needs to be diagnosed. There are also very practical reasons for having that manual. A lot of the times in countries that have private health insurance, you can't really, you won't be covered, or your treatment won't be covered unless the doctor you see specifies the diagnosis. And so in some cases there's a very practical reason for it. It can save you a lot of money when you are seeking treatment, to get help with some of these issues.
definitely. So yeah, I reckon. I mean, from my perspective, I reckon it's sensible to suggest that, when you're faced with a problem, you do not rule out all the possibilities. You
Sure,
exercise all the control that you have to
sure,
fix the issue yourself, and
of course.
also alternatively, before you go to the quick fix.
Yeah,
But I think the problem is
yeah,
people like to go to the quick fix first before we
sure.
get into trying to fix it yourself. So I think,
Yeah.
would you agree with my perspective that it's better to go to exercise the options you have first before you go to the clinicians instead?
Sure. I mean, again, I think with that there isn't a kind of straight yes or no answer because
Sure,
if
yeah.
you're, yeah, if you're dealing with somebody who has a very serious case of depression or a very serious case of anxiety, or some form of addiction, sometimes if it's that far along, and if say they may pose a threat to themselves, if they have suicidal thoughts or things like that, you really do need to seek treatment very, very quickly. So you kind of, you don't have that much time at that point to kind of be fiddling around and taking your time to
Sure,
figure out what it is. So I think in those more pressing situations, it is really important to get the help that you need as quickly as you possibly can, either for yourself or for a loved one, or for a friend. I think in other instances, if it's not something that's kind of incredibly acute and pressing and causing you a lot of damage in your life, I think it's worth it to kind of take a step back and look at the overall picture and kind of think about what you think this may be. Maybe talk to a friend or a family member first, but to definitely not shy away from them then speaking to an expert. And it doesn't have to be a psychiatrist. It can be a coach. It can be a counselor, whoever you want. It can be an old teacher of yours, an old mentor, but I think the most important thing is to just not sit with it by ourselves. I think part of the problem also is that in our culture we do tend to give an excessive amount of personal responsibility. We tend to place a lot of weight on people as individuals to change things about
mm,
themselves. And while obviously as a parenting coach and a psychotherapist, I'm all about that because that's what I'm trying to do with people. I'm trying to enable them to do a lot of things for themselves to help themselves. We really can't underestimate how important our environment is and how important it is for us to really be able to tap into the resources that we have around us. And I think that also kind of forms part of what it means to be emotionally intelligent. It's to really know when I've reached my limit now. There's nothing else that I can do for myself anymore. I need to look at other people now. I need to get help from family or friends, or I need to talk to a specialist or a professional, whoever it is, so that we really don't place all the blame and kind of all the responsibility onto that person as an individual. And I think in kind of, again, in the Western world where we have more individualist societies, we really tend to do that
sure.
far too much. We don't encourage people enough to connect with other people, to talk to other people when they're experiencing difficulties in life.
Definitely so. I mean, that's a lot. That's a good sort of guideline recommendation to work through in terms of like risk
Sure,
assessing the situation, in terms of how
sure.
severe it is and how to act based on the situation. So
Yeah,
that's definitely a good tips there.
sure.
I'd say to kind of prevent that situation from happening in hindsight. Do you What sort of tips would you give parents to help children optimize their use of technology? I mean, a lot of parents like to suggest, bringing children to the outdoors, and
Yes,
they talk about sports being important when you're a child, and
absolutely. Yeah,
encouraging that. I've already mentioned it in terms of what I've done later on in life. What do you think
yeah,
are good suggestions to help
yeah.
optimize their use of technology?
Sure, sure. I think again, to begin with, kind of the foundation for everything is really just to know your child, which again, parents just tend to instinctively do anyway.
Yeah.
And it's really to observe them and to really get to know what they're like. Do they tend to be more introverted or more extroverted? Do they tend to like to have only a few friends or more friends? Do they like to spend more time alone in their room, or do they like to be out in nature? Once you have those kind of basic parameters, you can understand, first of all, why your child has the tech habits that they do. And then that will also tell you what can we actually do about them. if we want to change them up a little bit. So that, for example, if you have, if you have a child who likes to be very helpful and likes to do things with others, you can try and kind of make an exchange between the time they spend on tech and try and get them involved with, say, charities, or they can do some volunteer work, or they can maybe teach younger kids to do things, or they can maybe help you in the kitchen or around the house, or whatever else it is. And it doesn't mean that technology should completely be removed from that scenario. You can still have, say, music playing on Spotify, or you can maybe have a cartoon playing in the background. But really trying to understand what your child's strengths are, and to really try and amplify them as much as possible, as much as you possibly can. Again, given your time restrictions and things like that. One of the things that I think parents kind of fear doing a lot, not just around technology, but in general, is really setting limits on with their kids, and kind of having very clear rules, and really sort of implementing their value system, and saying, this is what we do here, and this is what we don't do in our home, in our family, and so on. And I'm currently working on which I'm very excited about, on a blog series with parents who use technology in a very mindful way with their children. And so I've just started doing this series of interviews, for the time being, with moms. They all seem to be moms of boys. It just kind of happened that way. But I've been talking to them about the ways in which they do this with their kids. And one of the main thing that really comes out from me so far from these conversations is the fact that they have very clear values. They have very, very clear concepts of how we use technology as a family, which doesn't then translate into, this is how you use tech in our home, and when you're outside of our home, you go nuts and you do whatever else it is. So I have moms saying to me that, for example, we have rules around commercials, and I don't want my child to be exposed to any commercials. He's far too young, and I just don't want him to. And so the rule that they, for example, have created is that any time that he is in someone else's home, or he is looking at somebody else's iPhone, first of all, he's not allowed to look at anybody else's phone when his parent or somebody he trusts is not there. But then anytime that an ad comes up, what he does is he has two options: either to just look away, or to kind of remove himself from that situation, or to reach out to an adult and say, is this a commercial that's all right for me to watch? And he does this whether he's at his home, or at his school, or at a play date, or whatever it is, which oftentimes, if you tell adults that, they'll think, wow, that is incredibly conscientious behavior. Can an 8-year-old really do that? They absolutely can. If that is, if that is the value that is kind of solidified within the home, if that is a conversation that is being had, not in an authoritarian kind of a way where it's, you must not look at any kind of commercial. It's not that. It's the other thing is that the parents I've interviewed so far have conversations with their kids. They talk about it all the time. They point things out in the environment, or they talk about other kids' behavior, or they talk about family members' behavior around technology. And they talk about, what do you notice there? What do you like about that? What do you not like about that? Would you want to repeat any of it? Would you want to change any of it? So I think those are some of the kind of global tips that I would give to parents. Don't be afraid to set limits, to set them for a reason, so that your child knows why that's being done. Not so that they kind of blindly need to follow these rules. Rules around gaming, for example. So I had one mom say that, we have rules around what are the acceptable and non-acceptable types of games that he plays. And so when they were out, it was, Thanksgiving recently in the US, they were having lunch at a friend's house. There were quite a few kids there. And one of the kids, who's about 3 or 4 years older than the boy, she was playing a game of some kind. And so he was there. He obviously wanted to play it with her. The first thing he did was he went to his mom and he said, "Mom, can I play a game with her?" And his mom said, "What's the game like? What does it involve? What happens there?" And he said, "Well, come, ask her so she can tell you what it is." And then once they explained that it was about, I forget what it was exactly, but it was something about being creative and building a world and, characters and things like that. Then the mom said, "Yes, you can," and go ahead. And they did it for about an hour and a half, right? Or something like that, which in theory, you would never encourage a child to spend that long on tech, but it's all about the context. And so in that case, it was a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And he knew to come and ask mom first, because that is a rule in their home. That is a value. We don't just kind of passively absorb any kind of game or any kind of content. So I think that would really be the main thing that I would say to parents, to really not be afraid, to be very clear on your values, to communicate
Mhm.
them to your kids, to explain to them why do we have these values, to explain to your kids concepts that maybe sound very complex even to you as a parent, but things like persuasive design. I think every parent has to know what that is at this point. And sometimes they'll roll their eyes when I talk about it, but I always assure them that this is, you just have to, the same way you have to know kind of the nutritional balance that your child needs nowadays. You have to understand persuasive design, and you have to understand these ideas around move fast and break things and all these different things. You really have to know what they are, because that's what gives you the know-how to talk to your child about these things. That's one of the other things that parents are terrified of, is that they know a lot less about technology than their kids do. And then they say, how am I going to implement rules and restrictions? Well, I have no clue what Snapchat is. I have no clue what
Sure.
Minecraft is. I don't know what these things are and how they operate. So I think one of the important things is for parents to educate themselves as well, and to understand what is going on. And one of the other concepts that I really like is that no matter how much technology might change, parenting is always going to stay the same. That never changes. And,
Sure.
and and it's always been true that the parent generation has always known less than the child generation when it comes to technology anyway. It was true of my generation. It's true of people who are older than me. That was always the case. But your parent is always your parent. It doesn't matter what form of technology you're surrounded by. So I really think the kind of the most helpful, I think, things for parents, the most empowering one, is really to not have that fear when it comes to that. I see that way too much in parents nowadays, and I feel like the presence of technology in all of our lives is only making it worse. It's only making them feel less and less secure in their ability to be a very kind of centered and strong figure for their children, who is going to set limits around technology. So I really think that's the most important thing. And like I said, so far from what I've seen, kids follow these rules exceptionally well. Again, some of the moms I've spoken to have said that because their kids are so, and these are 6 and 7 and 8 year olds, because they're so clear about how they use technology and how they want to engage with the world, like through sport, instruments, this kind of one-on-one engagement, their kids on their own have just stopped spending time with kids who are hooked on their devices.
Hmm.
It's not pleasurable to them. They just don't like it. A lot of parents are afraid the opposite happens. That they're going to go in and they're going to become zombies, and I'm going to lose my child. And you won't, as long as those values and those rules and expectations are very, very clear, and you implement them on a regular basis, which again is true of really anything when it comes to parenting. It's all about consistency.
That's interesting. So, I mean, just to summarize, you talk about, importance of routine, importance of
Ab-
managing expectations,
of course.
setting the values, taking full
Yeah,
control, direct, honest communication with your
absolutely.
children. It kind
Yes.
of reminds me of a conversation I had with my sister-in-law, who
Right.
she actually said that she's going to start this rule in her
Right.
family that, there's no mobile phones at the dinner table. And I thought, oh,
Sure.
I'm really proud of that.
Yeah,
I just thought that's
absolutely.
very
Yes.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, to begin with, again, especially if your children are a little bit older, if they're kind of in the tween years, and there weren't any rules in the home up until that point, and then you come in and you say something like, no smartphones around the dinner table, that might be difficult to begin with. But
Yeah.
using that as an example, there are definitely right ways of doing that, or helpful ways of doing that are
So,
more likely to succeed, and there are ways that are not that great. So you always want to explain why you're doing it. You could say, I read this book, or I read this article, or I listened to this podcast, and this is what the person said, and I thought that was really interesting, and I see how technology impacts us as a family. What do you think about that? What do you think about my desire for us to be more connected at the dinner table? And also to allow a little bit of room for failure. I don't think we do that enough when it comes to anything, really, to really be honest also with your kids. And again, the moms that I've been interviewing have said this as well. When you mess up, and when you binge, or when you bring your phone into the bedroom. One of the moms was telling me that one morning her son came into her bedroom, and she was on her phone, and that was a very explicit rule that they had that applied to everybody in the home. Nobody is allowed to bring their phone into the bedroom. So he went in, he took the phone, and he hit her over the head with it, saying, "Mom, you're breaking your own rule,
Wow.
so
Okay.
obviously she told him off, for being physically violent, but said, you're right to tell me off because I've broken my own rule, and I wouldn't like it if I caught you with a device, in your own bedroom. So it's really for us as grown-ups to also let kids know that because of these things such as persuasive design and this avoidance of boredom and discomfort, we also find it very difficult to manage these things. We also find it very difficult to set rules for ourselves. We find it hard to follow values ourselves that we have created, as adults. And so, of course, it's going to be incredibly difficult for the
Sure.
6, 7, 8, or 15-year-old because, again, their brains aren't fully developed yet, and aren't fully integrated and connected to the point where they can say, you know what, I'm only going to spend 5 minutes instead of 10, or I'm only going to have one candy bar instead of 20, or I'm going to have juice and not a liter of vodka, whatever else it is. That being able to inhibit and manage ourselves really comes with a lot of practice and with age. And I think it's very important for parents to show their kids that vulnerable side of themselves. It's just very, very human, really.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. It's very, yeah, there's so much to unpack from what you're saying, but yeah, no, I feel like we've touched upon a lot of we've echoed a lot of those concepts before,
Sure.
and kind of going back to say the earlier stages, growing up and kind of um, taking care of a baby, for instance. You mentioned this new form of technology called smart diapers,
Yeah.
and that's something I've never heard of before.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if you could expand, let me know what that is and what are
Sure.
your
Sure.
thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I don't think that's been released yet into the market. So we'll need to
Oh,
see what
okay.
happens once it does. I'll need to check in again, but I don't think it has. But it's basically a new form of technology that's been developed by Pampers. I'm guessing other brands will kind of jump on that bandwagon. But the idea is that it's going to be a smart diaper that's going to be connected to your device of choice, via an app, and it's going to be able to tell you a number of different things about your child. For the most part, it will be their, whether they've peed and done what they need to do, inside their diaper. And I didn't know that this existed either until a couple of months ago, when I first read about it, and it just kind of found it to be, I don't even know what the word would be that I would use to describe my reaction when I first found out about that. Because and again, I'm not talking about instances in which, say, there are health concerns with the baby, and that could be hugely helpful, for health reasons, or anything like that. That's really kind of almost life or death, or kind of health related. That I don't talk about those categories. Again, I'm talking about just kind of your regular, again, normal, in that developmental sense, children. And again, it goes back to that conversation about being connected to the child, and being in touch with the child,
Sure.
observing that child, being available, being responsive, being attentive. One of the main ways in which parents do that in the very earliest stages is by being attuned to the child's physiology. And so it's, are they cold? Are they warm? Are they thirsty? Are they hungry? Have they done what they needed to in the diaper? And through checking all of those different things, that is the way in which you're connected to your child before your child has the ability to speak to you, before they really have the ability to communicate with you in any other significant kind of way. That's all you have. That is your baby's language when they're that tiny. So again, the question is, if you outsource that
Yeah.
to not just a form of tech to another person, it doesn't matter, whoever it is, but you're not the one who's engaged in that. What does that mean, again, for that child, and what does that mean for that sense of self that they developed through you being there with them, through you tracking these things, through you being responsive and being reactive and being attuned and being in all of these different things. I think that, again, it's that attachment and that attentiveness that is at stake in all of these different stages from those very, very early ons. And again, we can all imagine in certain scenarios in which that might be, again, even life-saving, in cases in which it might be very, very helpful. But my understanding, and I may be wrong, is that this will be marketed just to the general audience. It's not going
Sure.
to be something that's only marketed in, say, hospitals or kind of more specialized environments like that. It's just going to be a kind of generally publicly available piece of tech that can be purchased by any parent. Again, when it comes to that, that kind of, well, it's going to be a wearable, I guess, technically speaking, right? Because the baby's wearing these diapers. I don't know if there might be other kind of issues there that will need to be taken into consideration, such as, is it even healthy for the baby to have that on themselves? Because there
Sure.
will need to be some kind of technology built in, right, that's going to be sending this data to the parent. Again, then you have issues with data protection and privacy, because the app is going to have access to things like the baby's gender, say their weight, maybe what they eat, where they were born, but a number of different things. So I think that example for me kind of encapsulates a lot of these issues that I think we need to think about when it comes to all different forms of technology, and especially, again, to the youngest of babies. I think when parents are in that kind of beginners phase of being parents, they're so incredibly insecure so much of the time, and they're so unsure of themselves, and they're so afraid to touch their baby, let alone do anything else with them.
Sure.
They're kind of, oftentimes they're lacking confidence to begin with. I really see that kind of interjection of technology is only making it even worse, because again, there's that idea that I can do this better than you. I, the smart diaper, sock, onesie, cradle, crib, milk bottle, whatever it is, I can do this better because I can use metrics and I can measure things precisely, and I'll give you a message and then you do that. So that's the part that I'm very uncomfortable with. Again, when we're talking about humane technology and when we're talking about what are the best ways possible in which we can support parents, I'm not sure that supports parents as much as makes them feel less competent, and makes them feel like, oh, there's a piece of tech here that knows how to do this better than I can. But again, we're going to have to see, because we don't know. I don't know how much research has been done on this. I would imagine it wouldn't have been very extensive, because it takes a lot of time to do this properly. So it's going to be another experiment probably, where it's going to come out, and first we'll see how many parents show interest in it. Once they start using it with their kids, we'll see, do they like it? Do they not like it? Does it really genuinely help them? Does it not? It's another one of those, we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Of course, I have to try my best to be impartial on these matters, because obviously there's not enough research.
Sure.
But
No,
from a humane level, my knee-jerk reaction is to express distaste towards this, because it's like,
exactly.
why
Sure.
would you outsource responsibility,
Sure.
accountability for your child to
Yeah.
begin with? Why
Sure.
why have we gone so low? Those are the thoughts I've had in my head. But
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
obviously, I take that with a grain of salt. But
Absolutely. Yeah.
it kind of talks, it's all the same themes about, it's causing interruption, and
Yeah.
there's, if you give people a chance for a shortcut, they may take it, and
Sure.
there's all sorts. But yeah, of course, conscious of time, don't want to keep reiterating the same points. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's interesting to know. I wonder what will happen in the future
Yeah.
as a result of
Yeah.
this.
We all do. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
have to wait and see.
Yeah.
And it is encouraging, though, from what you've said, regarding, the examples you've given of parents who have actually set the example. And
Yeah.
I think it's encouraging for those who are watching and listening, the fact that
For sure.
there is a way through, and there is a method, there is a way to take control of this. And because technology just seems so, because it's expanding so much, the internet is so vast, and kids have free access to it, and all
Yeah.
sorts of things can happen. But the fact that, as a parent, you do still have power, control, and authority to do something about it, it's encouraging. That's
Yeah,
the
yeah, and
thing.
that's why I really wanted to do this series. I have
Yeah,
a few parents, like I said, primarily moms for now. I want to expand it and speak to a lot of dads as well, because I really want, I just want parents to not just need to listen to me talking about it as
sure.
the psychologist, psychotherapist, parenting coach, the person who works with kids, but I want them to be able to hear from parents who are actually implementing a lot of these kinds of tips and techniques and approaches that I advocate for as well, because unless I have a real life example, I can't convince anyone that this is possible. Again, like I said, if you tell certain parents that an 8-year-old is capable of coming and asking for permission first, whether to play a certain game or engage in a certain tech-based activity, they'll probably think that's science fiction. There's no way an 8-year-old would ever be able to do that, but they absolutely can. And I think oftentimes what we end up doing is we really highly underestimate children's levels of maturity, their levels of intelligence, their levels of independence. I think we're always underestimating kids by at least about a year or two. And I think that does them such a huge disservice. And I think it also prevents us from really enabling them to be as independent as they can be, and kind of free thinkers, and really give them the opportunities to try and self-regulate, to try and figure out these crazy confusing emotions inside of themselves, and give them the opportunities to make lots of mistakes, and really make a mess of things, so that they can then come back to us and say, oops, I played Minecraft for 5 hours today, and then we can talk about, okay, we don't go straight into punishment mode. We talk about, why do you think that happened? What were the circumstances under which it happened? What was it that drew you to it? What was it that you loved about it? What was it that you didn't like about it? Would you want to do more of it? How can we make sure that you can enjoy the positive aspects of it, but so that it doesn't get to be, too much? So I really want parents to have a very clear picture of other parents who have tried and tested these things, whose kids are starting to enter those kind of tween years, so that they're a little bit older, so that they can really have a sense of, okay, progressively, almost kind of from zero until now, what were some of the practices that you were engaging in order to build up this culture. It's really a culture of digital awareness and digital intelligence and mindful tech use, that a child can benefit so hugely from, especially as they kind of enter their teen years.
Definitely, and speaking to the intelligence that kids have, and the rise in the technological revolution. I mean, we've talked a lot about the negatives, and I don't want to make this all about doom and gloom as well. Of course not.
Absolutely.
And I think what would be nice to know from your perspective is, what do you think are the ways we can optimize technology to suit the human? Because I've heard there's a lot of research into this. I mean, there's research in terms of UX, in terms of designing things to make it more usable. There's ways in which we can do, say, honest advertising versus marketing and manipulation, for instance. There's a lot of different themes, ways to unpack it, and just ethical advertising. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that question as well is quite a bit, is quite a big kind of a big chunk to bite off, because again, there's so many implications there. We're talking about the way we advertise. How do we want to do it? We're not meant to be advertising to children, and yet we know what happens all the time. So what are we going to do with that, in terms of, again, data protection, data privacy, giving consent? How are we going to do that? Do we want to keep doing it the way we have so far? Do we want to use the slightly random age of 13 as a cutoff? Do we want to push it so that it's maybe 14 or 15 or 16 even, so that kids aren't using social media before then? And then there's the question of design, and how do we want technology to look? There's the question of integration. So like I was saying before, there are these moves to make technology integrate a lot better, a lot more seamlessly into our lives. I, for one, am against that as a kind of personal choice. In my life, I wouldn't want that as a consumer, as a user. I want technology to require effort for me to use, because then I'm going to think about it twice or three times or four times. I'm a lot less likely to engage in it. So I think that one of the things that we actually need to use, or to do rather, is to create more of a separation between the human and the tech. I think the more seamless we make it, and the more we integrate it, and the less friction that there is, the more we're going to use it. The more we're going to use it, even in passive ways. So if you look at wearables, for example, they're on you all the time, more or less, right? Because it's fully seamless and fully integrated. So again, when it comes to data, they're constantly collecting your data. If you look at the home-based smart speakers, they're constantly there unless you unhook them. they're constantly recording what's going on, and they're constantly kind of absorbing the data and trying to kind of throw stuff out back at you as a result of their input. And again, the question of consent there, and like you said, transparency is a really huge one. So for me, I've been asked about humane tech before, and again, what I think that means to me. Humane tech is technology that knows how to make itself scarce when we don't want it. It's the kind
Sure.
of technology that knows how to back off and say, I did my thing, I provided you with the information or the help or whatever it was you wanted. I'm going to get out of your hair now, and I'm going to let you be human, and you do your human thing. You talk to other humans, you do whatever it is. I'm just kind of going to disappear.
Mm.
For one, I think that's what humane technology is. So like I said, I'm not for making it seamless, because I think that will make it more difficult to manage, the more seamless that it is. So I think that's probably one of the most important things that we can do. And then as we go deeper into it, I think it gets a little bit more complex, because then we're talking about how do we collect data and how do we protect it, and how do we do that when it comes to children in particular. What do we do about advertising and about media,
Sure.
and about things like that. And there's, again, I mean, there's so many wonderful, again, aspects of technology, and so many wonderful and useful ways of using it. Like I said, anything that allows you to communicate more, and that allows you to develop your relationship with your loved ones is wonderful. So being able to have things like WhatsApp and Viber and
Sure.
Skype and Zoom and all these different things is incredible. You and I wouldn't be speaking to each other right now if it wasn't for these types of technologies, and we live in two different countries. So I think there's a lot to be grateful for there. There's a lot to be thankful for there. Like I said, emojis are one of the things that I love most about technology. Another one is being able to have something like maps, so that no matter what country you're in, you'll never really feel lost. Although there's something to say about feeling lost, and I love that tagline
Yeah.
from the Australian tourism board's ads, that sometimes you have to get lost to find yourself. So I've, in terms of my own kind of digital health and wellness, one of the things that I've started pulling back from a little bit more is using Google Maps too much. There seems to be some preliminary evidence that relying on it too much can actually impair certain parts of our brains that are involved in visual spatial coordination, our sense in space, our ability to navigate, and so on. And there might potentially be some implications for Alzheimer's disease further down the line too. So we definitely don't want to have technology that makes us sick one day. I think we can all agree on that. So that's
Mhm.
definitely not something that we want. But I think any form of technology that really does enhance your life, that improves your life, definitely that makes you feel better. Because if it makes you feel worse, why would we want to spend time around that? Why would we want to use that kind of a kind of man-made product, unless it's really there to do good?
Sure.
So I think those are kind of some of my kind of main thoughts when it comes to really thinking about what does, on the one hand, humane technology mean, but also what do we mean when we talk about digitally healthy cultures, and creating those digitally healthy and mindful cultures, whether it's in the workspace, whether it's in a romantic relationship, whether it's at home, whether it's in a school. I think we really need to think about those things, and put a lot of forethought into them, instead of doing the whole move fast and break things approach.
Definitely. I think, well, two major leaps we've made is GDPR. The fact that,
For sure.
as
Yeah.
users, we're entitled to know where our information is kept, where our
Right.
data is. We have a right to withhold that. And the
Exactly.
fact that there is a progression in UX, the fact that companies are looking at customers' pain points, and
Sure.
if a customer points out something they don't like, companies are more likely to oblige to that. So I think that's a step forward. And
Sure.
the fact that, for instance, with Mary Eichen, she's trying to put on child safety filters for the
Sure.
internet to
Yeah.
prevent them from being, wrongly targeted by criminals online, and things
Yeah.
like that. So I feel like those are good
Yeah.
steps forward, and that's
Ab-
something to be commended as well. So
of course.
although there's a lot of risks, there are some actions that are being taken, and there's more that we can do based on what you've suggested before. Um,
Absolutely.
But
Yeah. And like I said, I'm part of a few different organizations that I would really encourage people to look into because they're really concerned with a lot of these things that we talked about today. So
sure,
the Digital Wellness Collective is one of them. The Center for Humane Technology is another one. Another
sure.
one, the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood is another one. So there really are quite a few organizations out there. Common Sense Media, obviously, which I think is one of the kind of better known ones. The Association for Media Literacy. There are a bunch of different organizations that are really um, investing a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money sometimes as well to really explore all of these questions. And these are precisely the types of organizations that then will have access to politicians and governments and other kind of organizations higher up where they can actually change things on a kind of legal basis so that we can actually implement laws that will protect children, that will protect adults, that will protect our data and our privacy and I think our humanity as well, because that I think if you look at it in a more dramatic kind of apocalyptic view, it is our humanity that's at stake. And that is what we're all at the end of the day trying to preserve and to protect.
What a great statement to end it with in a
There you
nutshell.
go.
Wow.
That was
Yeah,
not
no,
intended. That just came out.
of course, of course. Yeah, I wasn't expecting for it to run for this length, but it
I
just
know we
shows
talked for a long
the
time.
extent, yeah, the extent of
Yeah,
your knowledge, and it's been a real journey. It really has to
yeah,
unpack. We've unpacked a lot of deeper themes about society and
yeah,
culture, and trying to instill change for those that are resistant to that change, and trying to what does it mean to be human, and
yeah,
concepts of child development, things like that. It's still a
yeah.
lot to learn. Cyber psychology as a field is still early, but it's good to know that there are steps we can take, and I
Yeah,
feel like there's a lot we can take from this conversation, from the examples you've given. I'm truly
right.
appreciative of that, and so again, thank you for your time.
Of
For
course.
for the viewers, I hope you found this helpful. If you want more advice from Teodora and content from her, you can check out her website on topcoaching.com, I
Yep,
believe.
that's right.
Fantastic. And you're on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, I
That
presume.
is correct. As mindfully as I possibly can be.
Great.
Although I find them so far, just personally have kind of been refusing to get on Instagram. I find I think that platform. I mean, Twitter and Facebook are similar, but
Mhm.
Instagram for me personally, again, I think it's a personal choice for people. Instagram is one that I feel would really just drag me into mindless tech use. So I do. Twitter is one for people who are really interested in a lot of the research that happens and very practical tips and things like that. Twitter is a pretty good place to follow me. For people who are interested in the more kind of professional side of things, LinkedIn, of course, is a good one. And then Facebook is probably the one where I'm the most, let's say, kind of casual or approachable in the way that I share information and things. But people can absolutely go to topcoaching.com, and if they have any questions, want more resources, I have a lot of free resources up there anyway. But if there's more stuff that they'd like from me, then to please feel free to email me. I'm one of those people who replies to all my emails. So somehow I will manage to do that.
Fantastic. And yeah, if you, for those who are watching, if you like to see more podcasts and content from my end, then you can access them through scitechacademy.com and subscribe on YouTube. I will include all the links in the description. But yeah, again, thank you so much for your time, Theodora.
Of course.
But for now, everyone, take care, take it easy, and see you later.
Bye.